So what is organizational communication? And what are we doing when we study and practice organizational communication? We can approach these questions from two different perspectives. First, we can think of organizational communication as the communication that happens within organizations. All the communication activity you'll see if you go to any organization today, writing memos, sending emails, talking on the phone, having meetings and more meetings, video conferencing, presentations, and so on. I think this is usually what comes to mind when most people initially think about organizational communication. But let's go deeper. Let's explore an alternative, more sophisticated approach of seeing organizations as communication. This can drastically change how we understand interaction and organizational life, and it opens exciting possibilities for research and practice. First, let's say a bit more about the conventional approach, communication within organizations. This perspective sees organizations like containers, and communication flows within the containers. If we extend the metaphor, we can see how communication is then influenced by the shape of the organizations, like how liquids take the shape of their physical containers. And shape can mean the physical shape of the organization, like if you have to take the elevator up 10 floors to deliver a report to your boss, or more of a symbolic shape, like where you are in the organizational hierarchy. The key here is that communication exists separately from the organization. Communication is thus organizational when it happens within these separate structures we call organizations. This relates to what scholars call the transmission model of communication, because communication is all about transmitting information throughout the container of the organization. And this is important stuff. From small businesses and multinational corporations to nonprofit organizations and government agencies, if people don't transmit the right information to the right people at the right times in the right ways, things fall apart. We certainly need effective communication within organizations. So the transmission model of communication isn't wrong, but it's also not enough. It doesn't fully capture the complexities of organizing and communicating for our modern society. After all, why is it that quote-unquote communication problems are continually mentioned as one of the main difficulties for most organizations? Is it just that people aren't getting the right information? Well, if so, this is mainly a technical problem that should improve as we develop better ways to get information to more people efficiently. But it seems like almost the opposite is happening. That the more advanced our communication technologies get, the more communication problems we have. Now, why is that? Perhaps there is more going on with communication than merely transmitting information. Turns out, people interpret the exact same message very differently. That people can be deceptive in their communication and their motives are incredibly difficult to figure out. That the meaning of language changes depending upon the context. Or that what you say is often much less important than how you say it. And that people often communicate for many more reasons than merely just to transmit information. And these are not exceptions. This is the normal state of affairs for most of our interactions. To account for all this, let's explore an alternative, more sophisticated approach to organizational communication. Organizations as communication. But this means we have to think very differently about communication, organizations, and the relationship between them. Instead of viewing communication as merely the transmission of information, this second approach goes deeper and sees communication as the fundamental process that shapes our social realities. It's how we socially construct the meanings and interpretations that shape our lives. Scholars call this a constitutive model of communication, because communication literally constitutes or establishes or makes up our social worlds. Why is this important? Well, the conventional approach of communication within organizations assumes there is this thing called the organization that just exists, and we simply focus on the communication that happens inside. But what exactly is the organization in the first place? Where did it come from? And how did it get here? Organizations aren't natural. They don't just exist in nature like trees and mountains and rivers. They are social realities created by people and their interactions. And people have different values, motivations, backgrounds, abilities, and resources. So organizations are never just neutral structures or containers that exist apart from human activity. They are the visible manifestations of our collective activity, of communication. And so at their core, organizations are communicative. Think about it. An organization is basically an ongoing collection of interactions, decisions, messages, interpretations, negotiations, contracts, relationships, and so forth. There's nothing else there that exists apart from communication. Well, let me qualify that just a bit. Certainly there are material or physical things there, like buildings, cubicles, tables, and other equipment. But these things have no inherent meaning apart from our interactions with each other. Plus, all the communication practices that constitute organizations always have to be materialized in some way if they're going to show up and make a difference in our lives. I'm not suggesting that organizations exist in an imaginary land of perceptions and wishful thinking, where the material world doesn't matter, it's all in your mind. No. This approach of organizations as communication is very much rooted in the material world of things and stuff that matter. But what I am saying is that these material things come together and have meaning as organizations only through communication. And I think this is a better perspective to guide our study and practice of organizational communication. But why complicate things with a more sophisticated approach? What do we gain? After all, the container metaphor and the idea of communication within organizations seem to describe how most of us actually experience organizational communication much of the time. And the physical realities of organizations seem to reinforce this conventional view. So what's wrong here? Well, the main shortcoming of the conventional approach is that it forces us to accept the organization as given, relegating communication as a separate phenomenon, leaving us only to examine how people transmit information within the system, but with limited capacity to understand and explain the nature of organizations in the first place. Plus, it treats communication as a neutral conduit of information, without recognizing that our interactions with each other actually create or change many of the very things we are communicating about. But if we expand our thinking of communication, it opens a whole new world of insight and understanding, plus new possibilities for practice and action. We'll start to see that so many organizational realities we often take for granted are actually created and sustained through our communication. And things could be otherwise. Communication is not just a thing to be explained, but rather a way of explaining other things, other social phenomena, especially organizations, like how certain patterns of interaction give rise to norms of conflict resolution, or how the values of a particular industry or sector shape the practice of leadership, or how interpersonal dynamics affect the success of an organizational change initiative. We can examine how certain views on race and gender emerge and are sustained through our communication practices, or how our professional identities are created and sustained through organizational communication. We can uncover hidden forms of power and control that are embedded within communication processes. We can explore ways to make organizations more equitable and inclusive by surfacing alternative voices. We can figure out how to develop organizations that are more productive, adaptive, and responsive through communication practices that encourage innovation and collaboration. Whatever the case, a constitutive view of organizations as communication provides a better way to understand and explain the complexities of organizing and communicating. What I'm advocating, therefore, is a communicative approach to our understanding of organizations. Or, to put it another way, taking a communication perspective to the study of organizations and organizing. Not simply treating communication as just another variable to be managed, but rather seeing communication as an explanatory framework from which to understand and explain all the complexities of organizational life. So what is organizational communication? Communication is organizational, not just because it happens within organizations, but because it constitutes organizations and gives organizations their existence, their way of being. To study organizational communication, therefore, means to examine and improve the fundamental social processes of organizing that create and sustain the main systems and institutions of our society.